This is the fourth and the last part of the series about why Russia fell, why the Soviet Union fell apart in the late 80s and the early 90s. In the earlier parts, we covered three phenomena. First, that the economy was such that nobody worked and there was no productivity. There was essentially no economy because money couldn't buy anything. There was no point in getting it. Secondly, that terror had been suspended and that Stalin had used terror to motivate work. But without either money as an incentive or terror as a punishment, nobody worked. And the third thing we talked about is that as the Soviet Union amassed an empire, the empire cost it money rather than helping the Soviet Union because of the way Russia treated her satellites. The fourth element in the collapse, probably the most interesting, is the way Reagan played the Soviet paranoia about military spending and goaded the Soviet Union into massively additional military spending, knowing full well that it would reach a point where it would cause an implosion of the entire Soviet economy. You go back to 1950s, when the United States had an overwhelming advantage over the Soviet Union in nuclear warfare. And Eisenhower knew that. Even though Kennedy talked about a missile gap, the fact is the missile gap worked the other way, and the United States had a huge lead over Russia. When Kennedy became president, everybody said, well, go ahead. We now want you to rearm the United States. You got elected saying there was a missile gap. And Kennedy saw that not only was there no missile gap, but the United States had a huge advantage. And Kennedy authorized Roswell Gilpatrick, one of the Undersecretary of Defense, to give a speech to that effect. And the speech shook up Moscow like crazy. The Politburo had emergency meetings with Khrushchev, who was the leader at the time, and said, hey, look at this missile gap. We didn't know that that existed. We thought we had superiority. And Khrushchev had to admit they didn't, and that led to a massive rearmament program. Initially, it led to Cuba attempting to station missiles in Cuba, and when that didn't work, they toppled Khrushchev, put in Brezhnev, who said he would now really make the Soviet Union achieve parity with the United States. And he dramatically increased Russian defense spending to do that. Under Nixon and Ford, there was an effort to try to keep parity and keep the Russian and American nuclear missiles at about the same number through various treaties. When Reagan came in, he said, let's use the Russian paranoia against them. Let's use their worry that the United States will get a lead to force them to spend more than they can possibly afford. And the way he did that was he invented the idea of Star Wars, saying that he would achieve an in-space missile defense capability that would render nuclear missiles obsolete. And the way the Soviets read that was it meant it would render their missiles obsolete, and that the United States could then have a first strike without any fear of retaliation. And the Russians went completely crazy, ballistic as it were. They did everything they could to stop the United States from going ahead with Star Wars. Gorbachev, who took over, said that he would agree to any kind of missile agreement as long as Star Wars was stopped. And the Russians dramatically increased their military spending. And it was a fool's errand. The United States never really perfected Star Wars. We aborted it before we could. It works in limited theaters, like the Israelis have shown in this past war, but in terms of a strategic, massive Star Wars capability, we don't have it. And Russia couldn't come up with it. Their computer technology was way, way, way behind ours and couldn't possibly do that. And it just wasted a whole lot of the Soviet Union's money. And then on top of that, Reagan squeezed them by giving missiles to the Afghan rebels, who then turned on us, became the Taliban. But while they had the missiles, the Stinger missiles, they attacked the Soviet helicopters in Afghanistan, drove up the costs of that war, and squeezed the Soviet Union financially and economically to a point where it totally imploded. And this didn't just happen by happenstance. It was a deliberate strategy of President Reagan and the head of the CIA, Casey, to bring that about. One of the great head fakes of all time. Thanks for watching.